Hello, this is Botany and Plant Sciences 031 Spring Wildflowers. Uh, this is the second lecture of week 9. There was no first lecture in week 9 because it was Memorial Day. And it corresponds to Wednesday, May the 27th of year 2020. Today, we're going to discuss a little bit the origin of agriculture and the role that cereals, which are the grains of the grass family, the larger grains in the grass family, have played in the development of human civilizations. So let me start with the lecture. We can see some slides. So the subject again is cereals and the development of cereal agriculture in relation to the development and the evolution of human civilizations. Let me start with a simple subject. I don't in any way pretend to give you a talk on human anthropology, but what we know is that the human species arose around 200,000 years, which is nothing, is very recently in evolutionary terms, in Central Africa, in the drier part of Africa, not in the tropical rainforest, in what is now Kenya, and all the way to the Horn of Africa and Somalia and Sudan, but mostly in the region of Kenya. And from there, humans radiated in different directions. Some were able to cross the Sahara to colonize northern Africa. Others were able to follow the trajectory of the Nile and from there colonize the Middle East, Europe, Siberia, and then follow two routes across Asia. One is the inland route and the other is the coastal route, until around some 13,000 or 15,000 years ago, the estimates diverge, they were able to cross the Bering Strait. At that time, there was a glaciation. The Wisconsin glacial period was happening. And so you could walk from what is now Russia to what is now Alaska. And they colonized in the last 12,000 years the whole of the American continent. Another branch colonized the islands of Southeast Asia all the way to Papua New Guinea. And from there, the humans colonized also the Australian continent. Quite some time before they were able to colonize the Americas. They did that. Australia was colonized by the Australian Aborigines some 60,000 years before present. The interesting thing, the subject that is important for this lecture, is that the humans that left Africa were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. They basically lived of hunting and gathering grains. And because in Africa they lived in semi-arid ecosystems in the savannas, we know and we can infer, and we also know from fossil evidence, that they must have been quite good, apart from hunting, in collecting plants from the savanna, especially seeds from legumes like the acacias and other woody legumes and some seasonal or annual herbaceous legumes from the savannas, and especially seeds of grasses. There are some grasses in the African savannas that have fairly large seeds that you can collect very easily. By the way, that's one of the interpretations why humans have this interesting prehensile hand, because you can actually, with your hand, you can grab a spike or a panicle of grass and pull and get a handful of seed that, if you're a hunter-gatherer, can be quite an effective way of provisioning yourself with seed. So agriculture was really developed during this long pilgrimage of humans from Africa all the way to Australia first and Tierra del Fuego at the end, the tip of the American continent. Very soon, all the continents were occupied by Homo sapiens, by human beings. And by very soon, I mean a period of probably 100,000 years, is not very soon in evolutionary times or in prehistoric times, not in historic times. Okay, now let me go to this person, this great scientist that we talked when we talked about the sunflowers. There was, and let me sort of migrate now to year 1920, shortly after the socialist uprising had occurred in Russia, and Lenin was able to topple the Tsar and the Tsarist government and install a socialist government. This Russian geneticist who was working at Oxford, Nikolai Vavilov, was very concerned about the ability of the Russian new system to provide itself with food. So he left a very comfortable position as a researcher and professor in Oxford and went back to Russia. At that time, it was named the Soviet Union, to the newly formed Russia, and convinced Lenin that they had to ensure the security of food production for the new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And Lenin really understood him and gave him funds to work in what his purpose was. I have to say something that is really interesting. This is a picture way before the Soviet Revolution by Vasily Perov, a Russian painter who painted the big heroes, the popular heroes of his time during the Tsarist regime in Russia. And he painted this curious and beautiful painting that is known as The Botanist. In 1874, it shows the importance that Russians have always given to the study of plants and the relationship between the study of plants and food security, the capacity of the country to provide itself with sustainable food. It has been always a challenge, and Russians are great, in general, Russians are great farmers, great agriculturalists. So anyway, Vavilov started thinking about what feeds a country like Russia and what feeds the world. And he realized that it's mostly cereals. Most of our calories, we get them from a few cereals. So he started making sort of idle drawings on the map. Where do these cereals come from? And he realized that they come from a small number of regions in the world. One is southern China, and if we extend it, it's the whole of southeastern, Asia, between India, Southeast Asia, and southern China, but especially southern China. He also realized that a lot of the things that were cultivated in Europe came from the Middle East. What is now Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. He realized that there are some important crops that evolved in Africa and were domesticated in Africa. And he also realized that ancestral areas of cultivation existed in the Andes in South America and in what is now Mexico and Guatemala, what we know as Mesoamerica in North America, north of the equator. And he realized that some very, very important crops came from these areas. For example, rice came from southern China, wheat, barley, and oats, they all came from the Fertile Crescent, from the Middle East. Sorghum and millet came from sub-Saharan Africa, especially from the African savannas. Corn came from Mexico, and the only exception was in the Andes. Although in the Andes they did have corn, the main staple was the potato, not a cereal. But look at this. This is really impressive. 5 small areas in the world have given origin to the most important crops that produce more than 90% of the calories we consume. And they come from a set of fairly small regions in the world. So Vavilov convinced the Soviet government to provide him funding to go around the world and collect seeds from these areas to form what he called a germplasm bank, a bank in St. Petersburg, where he could deposit all these seeds in special repositories as genetic backing for improvement of agriculture in the Soviet Union. Here's a photo of Avalov in a market in Guatemala, where he collected innumerable varieties of corn and also, of course, on beans and chilies. Vavilov also realized that in the same census of origin, not only were cereals cultivated as staples, but also there were always, in association with a cereal, there was a legume, what are known as pulses in the common language, some sort of legume seed, a dry legume seed that was cultivated for consumption too. And the reason was because legumes are, as we studied when we saw legumes, so rich in protein. And so they can actually provide a very protein high complement to a diet of cereal. So in the same 5 centers of origin, he realized that soybeans played a very important role in China and Southeast Asia, and other legumes like mung beans, for example, sweet peas, lentils, fava beans, and chickpeas or garbanzo beans played a really important role in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Black-eyed peas or cowpeas played a very important role in Africa. Lima beans in the Andes, and the normal kidney beans, all different colors from black to white in Mesoamerica. So he elaborated a really interesting theory. He was able to realize that agriculture didn't originate just anywhere. It originated in a few small parts of the world, and that in these parts, when it started, it helped the development of incredibly complex and large civilizations, like the old civilizations in China. We'll see a little bit about the civilizations in Africa, the civilizations in Mesopotamia, Persia, and in general the Middle East and the Mediterranean, the Andean civilizations and the Inca Empire, and of course the great civilizations of Mexico and Guatemala. So we'll see sort of quickly some of the places where cereals were. But what is important to realize at this point is that this occurred independently. It's almost like a mystery. It's like human beings had, in some way or other, had a destiny of organizing their complex civilizations, or our complex civilizations, associated around the cultivation of a cereal and a fairly elaborate type of agriculture. And it happened independently in all these parts. It happened over and over and over again. It was always a grain, a cereal with a legume, and of course many other crops, but a cereal and a legume were like the staple, the sort of the cornerstone of all these civilizations. For example, in the Middle East, this is a compound satellite image of the Middle East, the region where we have Turkey, Lebanon, Israel down here, and Iraq and parts of the highlands of Iran. And you will see a sort of green area here, which is really an area with slightly more rain around the Mediterranean and then the Caucasus Mountains in the north of these countries. This area is known as a fertile crescent because it has this large geographic shape that looks like a crescent. And in the fertile crescent, the landscape we have, it's very much like California in many aspects. It rains in winter, it doesn't rain in summer, it has very, very dry summers. And that favors the growth of annual plants, the same type of annual plants we study in spring wildflowers. And among the annual plants that grow there, you have this, which is wild wheat. And you also have wild oats and wild rye and wild barley, but a lot of wild wheat growing in this region. So you can imagine for the first humans that came from the African savannas, walked all down the Nile and then walked into the Middle East, and suddenly they found these ecosystems that produce huge amounts of grass seed that you can collect very easily. As I was saying, we have a prehensile hand Humans are monkeys with a prehensile hand, and you can pull the spike and get all the seeds coming out, and you can store them. So even if the wheat will be there for a short time of the year, you can store it and live most of the year with what you have stored. And of course, it doesn't take long once you start collecting seeds and storing them from some seed for some seeds to fall down on the ground near areas that are trampled. And of course, the next spring with rains, you will get new wheat coming out. And of course, because people select the seeds that they want, it doesn't take long for people to start selecting wild wheat with larger spikes, with larger caryopsis, larger seeds, and that they don't fall easily once they're dry, that they stay in the plant. And hence, you have there the origin of agriculture. Uh, Early settlers in the Middle East were able to develop here in the core area all sorts of things, all the way from barley, acorn wheat, and emmer wheat, which are the ancestors of what we know now as durum and bread wheat. Lentils, it's like cultivating lentils, peas, and veggies, legumes, and cereals. And from there, cereal agriculture expanded. Initially, it was only restricted to the crescent, but from there, in the fossil record, you start seeing years later and later, you start seeing fossil records, sorry, archaeological records with wheat seeds and with barley seeds, getting further and further away from the Fertile Crescent. Agriculture had started. Uh, Even so, the cultivated wheat wasn't really that different to the wild wheat. They look very similar and they behave pretty much the same way. They require winter rains and they will set seed in spring. But you can see 9,000 years before present, uh, or before 9,000 years before present, there were agriculture was all around the crescent from what is now Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. And then between 9,000 and 7,000 years before present, it had expanded into Turkey and along the rivers into a good part of Mesopotamia. And then from 7,000 years to 5,000 years uh, before present, agriculture expanded all along the Nile. People started learning that they could cultivate the same plants that grow in Syria and Israel and Lebanon. They could cultivate them in the Nile using, that is a desert, using water from the river. And it started being cultivated, they started being cultivated all along the Caucasus Mountains and into Europe. By 5,000 years before present, wheat, barley, and rye had colonized together with the legumes almost all of Europe. And then it took them a little bit to domesticate these plants into Switzerland and into Northern Europe because of the cold. But by 3,800 years before present, they were already being cultivated in parts of Scandinavia, all Germany, all France. And then by 2,500 years before present, they were cultivated all over Europe. We know this because the archaeological records for wheat cultivation is very specific. They have very specific tools to plant and to cultivate the wheat. And so in that long, long trajectory from 10,000 years BP to 2,000 years before BC, before the Common Era, during all that time, they developed, the humans in Europe developed different types of tools and agriculture in order to plant larger and larger areas. Wheat was a very, very important thing in the diet. And I find it really interesting how some people discuss this when it seems to be so obvious. Let me give you an anecdote. When I was a student in the United Kingdom, many years ago, in year 1978, I think it was, there was this scandal of a body being found in a glacier in Italy. And so they called the police and they called authorities because they thought that there had been an assassination. But when they looked at the body, It so happened that it was a climber, a high uh, Alps climber that had been assassinated up there in the glacier and had been for 5,000 years, according to radiocarbon dating, frozen in the glacier. And eventually the glacier took him down where it melted, and this is where it appeared and was found by a group of climbers when they were going up the mountains. This is really important because Otzi, that's the name they gave the person, allowed us to analyze what did he have in his stomach and what was he eating. And his content showed ibex. He ate meat, red deer, but especially herb bread with grain as well as roots and fruits. The grain was wheat, and chaff and grains of acorn, which is hard wheat and barley, and seeds of flax and poppy were also discovered, as well as kernels of sloes. The sloes are like plums from the blackthorn tree, and various seeds of berries. So Otzi was really a hunter-gatherer, a collector, but the only agricultural product he was eating, apart from hunting animals, was basically wheat and barley. So we know that 5,000 years ago, Europeans, even those that were far away from agricultural areas, high up in the mountains, who you would expect to be hunters, basically, were already eating significant amounts of wheat, which makes us perhaps make the inference that in the lowlands, wheat was already, and the consumption of grains was the fundamental element in the diet. As a matter of fact, there's a fascinating book called The Bog People, which is about corpses that have been found preserved in peat bogs all over Europe. Peat bogs are a formation of a moss, the sphagnum moss, and the water is very cold and very acidic. They occur in Scotland or Scandinavia. And so if somebody dies in a peat bog, they stay there preserved like forever. They become like pickled in the acidic water. And a number of corpses have been found in explorations on the bogs. This is the Tonland man. And because of these explorations, most of them assassinated, very sadly. Apparently, when somebody wanted to get rid of a corpse, you would throw him into a peat bog because they're so swampy that nobody would find him, and the body would become engulfed and preserved anaerobically in the peat. So the Tonland man, their stomachs were analyzed, and they have analyzed the stomach contents of a number of other peat people. There was no meat, fish, or fresh fruit. Only traces of grain and seeds could be found: barley, flaxseed, false flax, not grass. The last two grow in the wild, whereas barley and flaxseed were cultivated in the field. Other wheat seeds were also found in the continent. Some of them had probably been gathered, whereas others may have been mixed in by happenstance, totaling a diversity of 40 different kinds of seeds. The meal consisted of porridge or gruel made primarily of grains and seeds. Flaxseed had probably been added in order to increase the amount of fat, of oil, with no traces of meat. Other last meals have been discovered in other bog bodies, and their contents are very similar. So what we know is that before the height of the Roman Empire, when Europe was still an incipient civilization, people were basically eating cereals. And the people, especially in the lowlands, not in the mountains, were practically eating no meat at all. They had ceased to hunt, and they were eating cereals and other plants to complement the lack of lipids and the lack of protein in the cereals. So this will give us the evolution of wheat in humans. It's very old, and from the Middle East, it moved gradually into Asia, into Europe, where it formed the large civilizations of Europe, including the Greeks and the Romans, among many others. In Asia, a similar thing happened. You can see here, this red line here shows all the parts in Asia where the genus Oryza, the genus of rice, grows. And these red circles here show populations that started cultivating rice in very, very early times. You can see the genus Oryza grows in all these areas in Southeast Asia where there's monsoon rain. It rains very strongly part of the year and the fields become flooded, like our vernal pools here in California. And then as the dry season sets in, the grasses that have established in the flooded swamps start growing. And this is a diagram of the aquatic plants where rice started. So you have all these plains in South Asia that have depressions that become flooded. Rice becomes established there. It's an annual plant. And then as the dry season sets in and the water level sets down, using that water, you get rice plants growing and eventually they form grain. They're very easy to harvest because you harvest them in the dry season when the water is gone. And like wheat, 4,000 to 5,000 years before present, rice was being cultivated in southern China. And then from there, it expanded all across, at least this is the anthropological theory, the south of China, reaching what is now India. Like wheat, it gave origin to incredible civilizations, among other things because of this really interesting trait that rice has. It has still the evolutionary memory that it needs water. The rice seedling, the little planting, needs water during its initial stages. So cultivating rice demands flooding fields. And in order to flood fields, you need to level huge areas. Like here, for example, is a mountainous area that has been leveled for the plantation and the cultivation of rice. Of course, flooding in this type of terrain is not an easy thing. It demands, like here also, it demands an incredible amount of engineering. So around the cultivation of rice, very complex social organizations and engineering arose that continue to this day in the countries where rice originated. They're complex societies with high levels of technology in order to adapt what is basically a plant that grows in flooded ephemeral pools into a permanent cultivation. Rice has an incredible biological diversity and varieties. We tend to think that rice is only the white thing we see here, but there is an amazing variety in rice types and also in seed types. Very often the seed is the external part of the pericarp, like all grasses. The seed of rice is a caryopse. The external part of the pericarp is often hulled in order to give us a white rice, but it's a really beautiful, extremely complex plant with lots of varieties and different types of rice for different climates. In Africa, two plants evolved for agriculture, and this is very interesting because they were domesticated way after the early humans left Africa. So the ones that remained started doing agriculture some 7,000 years ago by selecting this plant here on the right that is a wild sorghum and selecting it for big panicles with a lot of fat seeds. This is a cultivated sorghum, and you can see the transition from here to here, pretty much like the wheat or pretty much like the rice. They got the spikelets and they selected the ones that had the biggest seed and started planting it. As you can see, I won't go into the varieties, but selection, like with wheat, made a transition from shattering varieties of sorghum, which are the wild varieties. Shattering is a word used by farmers to indicate that the seed falls when the plant is dry in order to disperse the seed. It's a natural reaction of a plant. To non-shattering, the African farmers were able to select non-shattering types of sorghum where the seed is maintained in the panicle so that they can harvest it when the plant is perfectly dry. And you can see the association between agriculture and the African savannas. This part here in the center, where the Democratic Republic of Congo is now, is the African rainforest. And all the varieties of sorghum evolved around a halo around the rainforest in the semi-arid or dry forests or even the dry grassland savannas that surround equatorial Africa. Again, like in many other parts of the world, the trade of cereals originated huge and complex civilizations. This is the famous buildings and temples of Timbuktu, where the traders' route departed north from what is now Mali into the Mediterranean, what is now Morocco, that at that time was basically a series of very developed societies like Carthage, for example, in the Mediterranean coast. And on the other side of Africa, on the eastern side of Africa, you will find in what is now Ethiopia, incredibly complex social organizations with some fascinating buildings that gave origin, that were originated by the sorghum and the millet agriculture. You can see here still this beautiful photograph, the association between the ancestral buildings used to live and to store the grain, and the fields down here with date palms, with olive trees, and of course with large expanses for the growth of sorghum. This is a girl in South Africa, a specialist, an agronomist, trying different varieties of millet for human consumption. Sorghum and millet. This is really nice to eat. As a matter of fact, if you go to any market that has grains and you find pearl millet in particular, it's so nice. You boil it. It's a little bit like quinoa. Really nice to eat. And here is a plantation, a cultivation of sorghum in a plot in Africa. In the Americas, the situation was pretty much the same. When humans arrived to the Americas, there was still a lot of what we know as a megafauna, large animals like the giant armadillos, the ground sloths, and large a number of species of carnivorous felines that made this very, and of course, mastodons, mammoths, and gomphothirs, all in the elephant family, that made this really curious motley assemblage of what we know as a Pleistocene megafauna. The humans that crossed into the Americas were incredibly efficient hunters. They very soon disposed of the megafauna, basically because of an evolutionary reason. The megafauna didn't recognize humans as predators. So especially the young of their species were very, very easy to hunt. And couple on that, a time in which glaciers were melting and the last glaciation ended, that implied massive environmental change, the megafauna went extinct. And the problem is that by around 8,000 years before present, humans had nothing to eat. They had ended their hunting, and they didn't have any more prey. So they started cultivating plants. They cultivated squash, they cultivated beans, and they started cultivating this plant here this is the spike. You can see the spike has really hard glooms that becomes almost like a drupe. It has a bony seed in order to protect itself from the megafauna. This plant could be eaten by ground sloths or by mammoths or by bison, tropical bison, but the seed would pass through the digestive tract and be able to germinate. Humans started cultivating this plant, apparently not so much for the seed itself, which is very difficult to eat, but for the cane. The cane in the ancestor of corn, this plant is called teosinte. The cane in teosinte is very sugary, and you can boil it and do all sorts of nice things. This is teosinte, cultivated in Chiapas, and this is the modern corn. And you can see basically what humans selected for was a variety that had only one stem. The lateral branches became contracted, so the leaves of the lateral branches surrounded the spike. The spike was selected for soft seed and larger spikes, and lo and behold, you have the transition from teosinte to an edible spike or an edible cob. And once you have that, all the rest is downhill. All the large civilizations of Mesoamerica originated around the cultivation of maize. All the civilizations in what is now central Mexico, on the coast of the Pacific, and to Guatemala highlands, and of course a large Maya civilization in what is now the Caribbean coast of Guatemala and the whole of the Yucatan Peninsula. They all hinged around the cultivation of maize in hundreds of different varieties and forms. As a matter of fact, in the Popol Vuh, which is the book of creation of the Mayas, you can see this, that you will also see in many other religions. It says, explaining the creation of humans, and thus they found the food, the yellow ears of corn and the white ears of corn, and this was what went into the flesh of created man, of the newly made man. This was his blood. Of corn, the blood of man was made. So the corn entered into the formation of man by the work of the forefathers. Popol Vuh, it's a sacred book of the Maya, which is really interesting. You will find also sacred associations between cereals and religion and beliefs, and especially the origin of humans in many other civilizations, including, of course, the ritual of a communion in Christian civilizations, which is basically the consumption of bread. The cultivation of corn gave incredible civilizations. I won't spend too much time in this, but really large agricultural settlements with a very, very high social level of social complexity, including the large, beautiful city of Tenochtitlan, which is what was conquered by Hernan Cortés when the Aztecs came to Mexico. It's interesting when the Spaniards came to Mexico. Tenochtitlan was occupied by the Aztecs. It's interesting. This is years before the present. Here's the transition between before BC and AD, the Common Era. And this is the amount of carbon-13 in the bones of human bodies exhumed for various ages. This is the radiocarbon age, and this is the concentration of carbon-13. Carbon-13 is an indicator of a physiology. A relatively high value of carbon-13 indicates that the person was fed on maize. A relatively low value of carbon-13 indicates that the person was fed mostly by hunting or by eating local grasses. And you can see in the central part of the United States, in between 500 years before Christ and the arrival of the Europeans to the US, how this value was increasing. So corn was still expanding fairly rapidly, as a matter of fact, into what is now the central part of the US. Corn is an amazing plant, has incredible variety in its grains. We discussed that when we saw the corn. You can actually see very often you can see the genetic traits of the sperm by the color of the grain. And a simple photo like this will give you an idea of the diversity of corn varieties and the number of types of corns, like we saw in rice, that are being made. So basically, what is the main idea behind this? What is the conclusion behind this? Well, I hope to have convinced you that really, if it wasn't because of cereals, we probably wouldn't have modern human civilizations. Cereals allowed human beings to organize themselves into cities, into complex settlements, into large societies, and to start specializing into different roles, including the arts, the sciences, literature, etc., etc. If it wasn't for the development of cereal agriculture, we probably would still be hunter-gatherers to this day. Well, thank you very much. Next Friday, we are going to see the gymnosperms, the conifer family in California. Thank you and have a nice couple of days.